Honing in on Russian warplanes, Ukraine's security service says its drones destroyed more than 40 aircraft, including nuclear-capable bombers. Moscow confirming airfields were targeted in 5 of its regions. They're the first attacks so deep into Russia, drones hidden on trucks, then released thousands of miles from Ukraine in what officials in Kyiv are calling Operation Spiderweb, 18 months in the planning. Just hours before, Russia said 2 railway bridges were blown up on its territory, derailing a passenger train carrying nearly 400 people and killing 7. Russia too launched its biggest overnight drone attack on Ukraine, just as the 2 sides prepare to meet for talks in Istanbul tomorrow. And it's the model of warfare the UK says it must now prepare for. The Defence Secretary saying it must send a message to Moscow with its new strategic defence review. The government will spend an extra £1.5 billion and build 6 new factories to produce weapons and explosives, creating thousands of British-built long-range weapons and 1,000 jobs in the process.
An armed forces is only as strong as the industry that stands behind them. So this is about making sure that if we're faced with conflict in future, we've got an industry that is capable of innovating and scaling up the production to meet those threats.
Mr. Healey called it a new era of threat, except it's not that new. Russia invaded Ukraine 3 years ago. And what Donald Trump has wanted all along is for Europe and to some extent the rest of the world to be able to look after themselves. Warnings too that we need to be able to produce everything in the UK if needed. Drones, an integral part of warfare in Ukraine, need to be manufactured cheaply and in bulk. And then there's Britain's nuclear deterrent. While the US can launch from land, air and sea, the UK only has submarine capability. The Sunday Times reporting today that there are talks to buy US combat aircraft capable of carrying smaller tactical nuclear weapons.
When Putin looked west 3 years ago before he invaded Ukraine, he didn't see a credible conventional deterrence from the UK and others, and didn't see a credible nuclear deterrence either, because he assumed that we would never use our ballistic nuclear missiles if Putin decided to use his. So I think this is a game changer.
What the UK has been criticised for in the past on home soil is failing to think ahead. Britain's steel industry, integral for wartime, has been decimated in some areas, and the military has faced cutbacks for years.
So not only have we sleepwalked into this, we're still sleepwalking. There seems to be a presumption that we've got the time to build up our forces to the point where we can credibly deter, or if needs be, take on the near enemy, which of course is Russia, and that we've got the time to be able to do this. This is a luxury that we might not have, given the pace at which international events can develop.
But this is the UK stating it is no longer part of a weakened West and showing proof it has woken up. No room anymore to play sleeping giants.
Francis Reid reporting. Well, for the UK Armed Forces, the story of the last 60 years has been one of doing more with less. As this graph from the Institute for Fiscal Studies shows, as spending on health and social security has gone up, defence spending as a share of national income has gone down. A so-called peace dividend spent on hospitals and welfare. Well, joining me now is one of the people who drew up that graph, Ben Zaranko from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and they've published their preview of the Chancellor's spending review due in just over a week. Thanks for coming in, Ben. I suspect we've got a few minutes of pure misery and cutting here. First off, defence. If you're going to beef up defence, 3% plus of GDP and so forth, you have to cut elsewhere. There's no avoiding that.
Well, the government's announced initial plans to go to 2.5% of GDP, that initial increase to be funded by cuts to foreign aid. If we want to go beyond that towards 3% or even higher, as, for example, President Trump wants us to, there's no getting away from the fact that you'd have to look at cutting something else or perhaps raising taxes. The cash simply has to come from somewhere.
And set against that, the biggest spending fund of all, of course, the NHS, that can't stay level. That has to increase as well, right?
Well, the NHS is the single biggest department. It's about 40% of all spending on public services. So what you decide to do there is of enormous budgetary significance. And given the fact that we've got an older population, we keep developing new medical technologies and new drugs that we want the NHS to provide, it seems likely that it's going to have to go up, especially if we're going to get hospital waiting times down, as this government has promised. It seems likely the NHS will be a relative winner next week.
And in terms of productivity, efficiency across all public sector departments, that can only get us so far, right?
Well, the government will be hoping that through efficiency gains or doing things in a more productive way, we can still deliver high-quality public services without having to spend more. And of course, that sounds great. And there are some areas of government where, of course, there are gains to be had, particularly post-pandemic, some bits of the NHS, the court system. There might be some improvements that can be had, but they can only go so far. And I think if you're looking for significant savings to pay for a big chunk of extra defence spending, for example, we have to be realistic about how much we can really deliver.
OK, well, I don't know what you at the Institute do in your spare time, but do you not just sit around and think, goodness me, there's no room for anything except cuts here. Why not get more money, raise taxes?
Well, spending is still going up overall, and the government will still get to allocate more than £600 billion of money. And you can achieve a lot with that. The things they choose to prioritise, they can make a real difference. We just live in quite difficult economic times where tough choices are unfortunately unavoidable, and not everything can be a priority.
And the pressure, of course, in the public sector, particularly NHS, the strike threat. We saw the action from nurses relatively recently, doctors, junior doctors too. That is always there, again, increasing the pressure, right?
Pay is a big chunk of what public services spend their money on. And if you're going to try and hold public service spending flat, that means holding pay relatively flat, unless you can make big job cuts. Those, of course, bring their own challenges. So, of course, all of this is bound up with those disputes with the public sector unions and with also what the government's trying to achieve and what staff it needs to do that.
Now, finally, just very briefly, NHS, the biggest one of all. What's your hunch? There will be increased spending. They can't hold it flat.
They can't hold it flat. The historic average for the NHS is about 3.5%. I would be shocked if it was below 2%.
Ben Zaranko, thanks very much indeed. Thanks.